I'll never apologize for the United States of America. Ever. I don't care what the facts are.
Why are we going to sit down and talk to these quote-unquote moderate rebels?
Who are the truly moderate rebels?
The search for the moderate rebel. Do these moderate rebels exist?
Moderate
rebels.
You are listening to Moderate Rebels. I'm Ben Norton, here with Max Blumenthal. Today we have a great special episode with one of our closest friends, Rania Khalek. In fact, it's kind of absurd that we haven't had her on the show up to this point, but finally we got her here. She has been living in Lebanon, but is now actually with Max in Washington, D.C. for this episode. And you know, what I've heard through the grapevine, the rumor is that you're around an orb of some sort.
Yeah, we got the band back together around the Orb of Evil, and, you know, we want to promote maximum levels of hatred, so we've got Rania in studio today. Like, all four of the, you know, people who hate us the most are going to have a conniption fit listening to this. Anyway, yeah, it's good to have Rania here, and for some reason we haven't had her on the show yet, but... she's in studio.
I'm in studio. Thanks for having me on, you guys. And
of course,
you should continue to punish yourselves verbally for not having had me on sooner.
Well, we wanted to overrepresent white men on this show.
That's fair.
They don't get enough attention in the mainstream media.
Yeah. That's why we created this, to create a platform for the people who Niall Ferguson says are discriminated against the most. Okay, so anyway, Rania, what the hell are you doing in Washington? I don't think that we've seen you here for a long time in the swamp. What brings you here, and what have you been doing with your life?
Well, I'm in Washington visiting family and friends for a few weeks, and I gotta say, like, I feel like since I've been here, everywhere I go, CNN is on. I feel like they're like trying to shove it down my throat. I don't remember if it was like that before.
So you've been in a lot of airport lounges.
No, not just the airport. I was like in a hotel elevator and there was a screen playing CNN. Like, it's like they're really trying to like reprogram people by forcing them to watch CNN all day long. And it's like every restaurant I go into.
This is like Saw number 13 or whatever number they're on. It's like the latest. You're trapped in an elevator and all you can watch is Anderson Cooper all day.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I notice when I come back to the U.S. after being out of the country, it's an extremely frightening atmosphere, and it's the media landscape that makes it so frightening. I guess you came just in time for the strikes on Syria. You know, explain the kind of the contrast that you feel from actually being in the Middle East and now being here.
Well, it's really weird because things have actually stabilized quite a bit in the last several months with regard to Syria, Lebanon, Iraq. All of the Middle East feels much more stable, especially with the defeat of ISIS. And in Syria specifically, the government has been retaking all of these areas from these insurgent groups, and things have been really calm, and I got on a plane thinking I was just going to come relax for a few weeks, hang out with my family, see some friends. And I got off the plane and there was like an alleged chemical attack in Syria and all hell broke loose. And it's like the media coverage just doesn't reflect anything taking place on the ground. It's like when you're watching the media coverage, it's like an apocalypse is taking place in the Middle East, but that's actually not what's happening at all. And especially the way people over there view it. People over there see the Syrian government taking back areas from insurgents as mostly a good thing. But the way it's portrayed in the media here is so it's like cartoonishly absurd because it's like the opposite. It's as if like villains are taking over Syria from like angels.
Yeah, I mean, it's just this narrative that we've had for the past 7 years, and you know, it's easy to get taken in by it, which is that the dictator Bashar al-Assad, who, you know, lives on a diet of, you know, baby blood, enjoys killing his own people and does it for fun. And these chemical attacks just keep occurring because he sees some sort of strategic significance in them. And, you know, those of us who follow it closely have a different perspective. And obviously people in Syria, in the government areas, have an especially different perspective. I mean, here we're dealing with two areas, Eastern Ghouta, which is a suburb to the east of Damascus, which has been a staging point for mortar attacks and shellings of the civilian population of Damascus for several years, ever since the Jaish al-Islam militia controlled this area. And it's kind of amazing to think that a militia was able to control an area that close to Damascus. And then Duma, which is right near eastern Ghouta, and that was the site of the supposed chemical attack. It occurred supposedly on April 7th, right after Jaish al-Islam, or the remnants of it, rejected a ceasefire with the Syrian government that had been negotiated by Russia, and then began shelling Damascus. I mean, am I getting the...
Actually, yeah, I'll add to what you that was a really good backgrounder to everything that was taking place at that time. But the Jaish al-Islam had actually agreed to this like negotiated ceasefire with the government, and then the negotiators of Jaish al-Islam suddenly disappeared and are believed to have been killed by the hardliners. And then the hardliners came back and started shelling Damascus. And in response to that, the Syrian government started bombarding Duma. And then within that time frame, there was claims of a chemical weapons attack.
And we have, all these conflicting accounts. But, there's one account that's been left out. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is a pro-opposition group based in Coventry, UK. It's a one-man operation that's been heavily criticized by supporters of the Syrian government. But they issued a report on April 7th saying that people were dying in basements from suffocation because they were hiding from conventional weapon shelling. There was no mention of chemical attacks. And then we have this allegation of a chemical attack. Robert Fisk gets into Duma after the dust clears and the Syrian government's able to guarantee journalist safety. Robert Fisk, the renowned Middle East correspondent from the UK Independent. And Fisk indicates, based on the testimony of a doctor, that what the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights was reporting was actually accurate, that there was an attack by conventional weapons by the Syrian army to drive out the last hardline remnants of Jaish al-Islam. People in basements had attempted to escape, and there was all these dust clouds and suffocation and the confusion from being attacked by conventional bombs, which are horrible. And somebody, according to Fisk's interviewee who witnessed the attack, a member of the White Helmets, yelled "chemical attack," and panic ensued. People were being sprayed down with hoses for no reason, and then they just alleged a chemical attack, which triggered the red line and provoked Western intervention. Just one more testimony I'd point to is from Hassan Diab, an 11-year-old boy who was featured in the video of people supposedly victims of this chemical attack being hosed down. I don't know why hosing them off helps, although maybe that's what you do after chlorine. And the 11-year-old boy Hassan Diab remarked that there was indeed no chemical attack and that he didn't know why he was being hosed down. His testimony has only been featured in Russian state-backed media, and for some reason, the U.S. media just hasn't wanted to talk to this kid. But I'm just pointing this all out to just give a little bit more background. But I think if you can kind of fill in the big picture, because you're talking about Syria being stabilized, I mean, basically the rebels in these areas, these key areas, were being defeated, and Syria was kind of returning to normal as a state. And then the U.S. media fails to convey that. And I think it's the most important piece of context to understand why the rebels might allege falsely that a chemical attack had occurred in order to trigger the red line.
This happened repeatedly. It's like an ongoing pattern that I think we've all noticed, which is whenever the rebels are about to be defeated. I don't want to stop calling them rebels because it's like a cute name. So let's call them insurgents. At least I will, because that's what they are. But the insurgent groups, whenever they're about to be defeated, they resort to making these claims of chemical weapons attacks. And sometimes the media picks it up, and other times it doesn't. They usually rely on the same outfits for footage of attacks, like the White Helmets and like SAMS, the Syrian American Medical Society. And the timing is just absolutely remarkable. Every single time they're about to be defeated anywhere, whether it's like some small little enclave or some big city like Duma, these claims are made. And but yeah, more to the bigger issue here is, and actually Max is going to be publishing a piece by me eventually, hopefully soon, on this issue. But Syria was stabilizing, and it was because of the defeat of these insurgent groups, and that also came along with a de-escalation of the war and a lot of reconciliation agreements. There's a lot of these agreements haven't been talked about in the mainstream press whatsoever, but all across Syria, cities and towns and neighborhoods have basically reconciled with the government under these agreements that start out as like sort of mini ceasefires on a daily basis, and then end up snowballing into bigger agreements that allow for the government to sort of come back into these areas and start re-providing state services like electricity and water, as long as the rebel groups put down their arms and put down their weapons and agree to stop fighting the government. And in some cases, in some areas I visited months ago, these former insurgent groups actually end up becoming local security forces.
Which areas did you visit? Just talk about your experience on the ground.
I visited a lot of suburbs of Damascus. One in particular that was really interesting to see was this area called El Hame, which is a sort of hill mountain area in suburbs of Damascus. And this was an area that was occupied for years by various insurgent groups, but the most powerful one being al-Nusra. And you know, a lot of the people who lived in that town actually ended up leaving because it was just, you know, once insurgent groups take over, they basically expel the state and there's no more state services. And you're just in a constant conflict. And actually, it got so bad that at one point, the people in El Hame they basically helped kick out these insurgent groups. They told them, like, leave or reconcile with the government. And so about 300 people stayed behind and reconciled with the government, and in exchange for putting down their weapons, they received amnesty, and they actually controlled the checkpoints into El Hame now. And then the people who decided to continue their fight were able to take their small arms with them to Idlib. And this only, of course, applies to Syrians. People who are foreign fighters don't have the opportunity to get amnesty, obviously, because they're in the country illegally. So they go to Idlib automatically. But I mean, this has actually worked in a lot of areas, because what I saw was this was months after this reconciliation took place and things returned to normal. And that's what people want their lives to return to normal. People in the West don't understand what being at war means. It means like your daily life stops as you know it. Your kids can't go to school. Water doesn't run. You have to get bottled water if it's even available. You know, everybody puts each other under siege, and so you just don't have access to, you know, food as much as you may have used to. And also, criminal gangs have taken over your area because there's no law and order. The state has been expelled, and when that happens, you have to turn to these criminal gangs that, like, which are in this case are insurgent groups, mostly Salafi jihadist insurgent groups in Syria, who make a lot of money off of jacking up the prices. I always said jacking up the prices of food and like basic like electricity, basic things that you need, but life as you know it doesn't function. And so it's far better to de-escalate the violence, even if that means the government is winning. And even for the other side, they've had to swallow that pill, because at this point, it's like, what's the point of this war anymore? And so when you hear the way I'm talking about it right now, and you compare that to the way Syria is talked about here, it's like two different situations that don't resemble each other, because the coverage is just so awful in this country.
Well, yeah, and what's interesting about this to me is this talking point we've heard for years, but especially in the past few months, it's intensified. This argument that from opposition supporters that if you oppose the opposition, if you want this war to end, that you are secretly pro-war and you can't call yourself anti-war. So, I mean, not only have these pro-war idlibs, if you will, you know, to quote Max's term,
idiot liberals, or idlibs for short.
Yeah, not only have they been viciously attacking the anti-war left, but they've been portraying the anti-war left as the belligerent ones, when actually, as Rania was just pointing out, if you want the war in Syria to end, if you don't want the fighting to keep on going for years, if you don't want the rebels, which are Salafi jihadist extremist groups at this point, virtually entirely, and especially in Idlib, but also in eastern Ghouta, in Duma, throughout these areas, if you want the war to come to an end, that you're portrayed as the pro-war one. It is bonkers.
The war is coming to an end by the defeat of these insurgent groups that the West and the Gulf Axis and Turkey had been supporting in the past. Support for them has been reduced, and now there's Astana and Turkey, Iran, and Russia really representing what you could call I mean, obviously, I'm not endorsing anything that all of these countries have done, but they would represent a peace process. These countries are going to oversee the future stabilization of Syria after they each get what they want out of it. And the U.S. is standing on the sidelines, and the U.S. and its allies have created this kind of fake Geneva process that they keep pointing to. But, you know, I mean, walk us through just the what you could actually call the peace process and why Western media, which is obviously guided by the military intelligence apparatus and the State Department, is sort of ignoring this. And, you know, obviously the Trump administration is furious that it's been left on the sidelines here.
Well, even before the Trump administration came into power, these local ceasefires were taking place, and they were happening with the involvement of local actors and with some guidance from Russia. And some of the states you just mentioned, and now Turkey sort of playing a role in this, Iran. But the point is the U.S. didn't actually just stand at the sidelines. The U.S. and its partners in France and Germany, like Western diplomats, basically tried to scuttle these agreements repeatedly because their argument was that ceasefires empowered the regime, because it basically means the regime is going to win because they have the military might to win. And the point is, it's like either the regime is going to win through military might and complete conquest, which ends up being like everything is just reduced to rubble, as you've seen in some areas like East Aleppo. And in that case, that was because the insurgent groups repeatedly refused to agree to ceasefires. And actually, at times when they did agree to ceasefires, they were guided by their funders who were arming them to actually not abide by them. And so there was...
In that case, it was Turkey.
Well, not just Turkey, but also the Saudis, the Qataris, the U.S. And there was times when actually, and this will be in what we end up publishing at some point at the Gray Zone, there was actually a time in 2015 when De Mistura, who's the UN
rapporteur
for Syria, he actually helped negotiate a ceasefire agreement between the insurgents in Aleppo, which were mostly led by al-Nusra, and the government. He got the government to agree to it. It was like a 6-week ceasefire, and then he was told, and the rebels actually did agree to it. But then he was told by Western diplomats not to implement this because it would empower the regime. And so that was constantly the thinking of the U.S., was that ceasefires are bad because they empower the regime. It's better for the war to continue to weaken it. And so, I mean, I can't remember where we started off and where you were asking me about this, but I think it's really important to emphasize that the role of the West in this situation has been to actually be against ceasefires and against de-escalating violence.
Which, I mean, kind of relates to the Western goal in Syria, which is fragmentation, the kind of whittling away of the state's capacity to maintain stability. Going back to the clean break document produced by a group of neoconservatives for Benjamin Netanyahu, when they spelled out what Israel's agenda in the region was. They said, after we topple Iraq, we're going to move in on Syria. And the point is to fragment it along sectarian lines, because this state has maintained this independent foreign policy in alliance with Iran. It's been, an important basis for supporting Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And so we're going to kind of start this domino process of toppling governments across the Middle East, but Syria is next after Iraq, and then obviously Iran is the prize. You saw references to this in the Project for a New American Centuries documents, and it's just become kind of a prevailing strategic guideline for the West in the Levant, which is fragment Syria, short of regime change. And I mean, I think regime change and fragmentation go hand in hand, but that sort of influenced and animated the way that the U.S. and its allies against Syria have treated the UN in Syria. I mean, you've seen these constant attacks on the UN and all sorts of international bodies for working with the Syrian government in order to get medical care to people. The Syria campaign, the PR arm of the White Helmets, I reported how they waged this gigantic attack on the UN because they were coordinating with the Syrian government, which is what you have to do in that kind of situation, right?
Yeah, and the UN in Syria has been pretty has been pretty brave in some ways, but also the UN forces them to stay. They like live in this weird prison-like situation at the Four Seasons in Damascus, where the UN doesn't allow them to leave except for certain hours in the day. So the UN people inside Syria, the UN staff, I've spoken to some of them before, they actually don't even really get to be outside of the Four Seasons that often. But the people that they work with on the ground, like the Syrian Red Crescent, it's really funny. The people they work with on the ground, which is the Syrian Red Crescent and other groups like that, which are also under heavy attack by these groups like the Syria campaign, are actually the ones that do some of the most, I would say, brave work, because they actually go into areas that are insurgent held and deliver aid, or they were at least before. Now there's not that many insurgent held areas left. But the UN has been used also to play a destabilizing role with Syria too. So, I mean, what's really crazy though is like people talk about regime change in Syria and about what the we always say the alternative is to the government that would happen if the Syrian government were to be removed is terrible. But one thing I think is really important to emphasize too is that we actually have legit like empirical examples of what regime change in Syria looks like, and it looks like what you saw in Aleppo. It looks like what you saw in eastern Ghouta. The regime was actually expelled from those areas, and you see who took over.
Well, you have this fake expert, Leila Shammi, I think her name is. And that's not her real name. We don't know anything about her.
It's a pen name.
It's a pen name. She, I think there's one image that I've been able to find of her, and she appears like behind a shroud or something, or like they ask camera people to not film her when she speaks at NYU or the Middle East Institute. And she has this narrative that's kind of managed to penetrate some left circles about how this is actually a democratic revolution of people who are embracing, anarchist style cooperative tactics in rebel or insurgent held areas. What was really happening in East Aleppo? And Ben, you can also weigh in on this. What kind of situation were people really living in East Aleppo, in Eastern Ghouta? And I guess you were able to go to Homs as well, Rania. So, I mean, you have been able to visit some of these areas after they've been liberated from these groups. But what was the real situation? What kind of government was actually?
It wasn't a government. It was like,
if you can call it that.
It wasn't even like a government. People, anarchists, I don't know how many anarchist listeners you have, but they're going to like hate me after hearing this. But when you get rid of the state, you have like, it's like Mad Max world. People who have weapons and resources take over. And that's what you had happen in those areas.
So it's not like a squat in Barcelona where like
you want to do drugs together and listen to, and have house shows.
20 people share a bathroom and clean together and cook like
vegan food you got in a dumpster. And
or like, I think at one point they tried to sell the idea that there was like some like anarcho-queer revolution happening in these areas.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, when I visited Homs,
it's fucking laughable, and the people who say this deserve like complete contempt, and like they're the ones who are like the real embodiment of Western white privilege or whatever they want to say, because you're talking about real people who live in the global South and they have to live under Salafi jihadi militias, and like it's not a fucking squat in Barcelona. So like it's not, you're not going dumpster diving and getting like Trader Joe's shampoo or whatever. Like it's something
locally
different.
grown organic like farmer market shit. No, it's not what's happening.
This is the biggest scam, I think, of like all of the Syria deception scams, is that like it's some woke anarchist revolution.
Well, some people fall for it, but like, okay, so I went to Homs, and one thing that becomes immediately apparent when you visit areas of Syria where the insurgents have been expelled is you notice that not like when you hear about Homs now, you in your mind get this image of like this completely destroyed place that's all rubble because the regime bombed everything. There are areas in Homs that the regime completely bombed, but it's really isolated to just like a couple neighborhoods that the insurgents were holed up in. So the regime, I mean, when they bomb stuff, they bomb everything, but they don't like just go bomb every civilian area. They're fighting an insurgency. And so in Homs, it's like this neighborhood Baba Amr, which is where a lot of the insurgents were holed up.
Well, Baba Amr was the big, one of the first major siege situations, which triggered a lot of international outrage. It's where Marie Colvin was killed. Well,
there is like every, the area the rest of Homs outside of Baba Amr was like normal. There was restaurants, there was business was bustling, cars are driving around, people are socializing. It was like a normal city. It was a really nice city. And life has gone back to normal, which is great because during the war, people, there's Alawite neighborhoods in Homs. There's a lot of Sunni neighborhoods where a lot of the insurgents would obviously take base because the insurgents are entirely Sunni. And then you had a few Shia neighborhoods here and there, but the insurgents would take over these like Sunni neighborhoods, and then they would use them as bases to like basically shell Alawite neighborhoods. And so you had this like sectarian warfare taking place that was really awful. Cars getting blown up, it was not a pleasant situation. I talked to people who were there. There was like mothers who'd lost children as soldiers in various parts of the country who like wanted it to be over. And one thing I found fascinating in Homs was like, when you hear about Syria, it's often like the Alawites are all like evil or something, and they all just want to eat Sunnis or something. Well, the Alawites you talk to just want that I spoke to, they're actually pretty soft. They're like, they want the war to be over. They want reconciliation to take place. The people who are most vengeful in Syria are actually Sunnis on the government side. There was this one intelligence guy who was like, who was a military man that I spoke to, military commander, and he was manning a checkpoint in this area outside of Homs that I visited that had recently reconciled with the government, which I can also talk about. But he was telling me he was from Idlib, and Idlib is an area where a lot of police officers come from. And he's pissed. He like wants to light Idlib on fire to get rid of the insurgents.
Because Idlib was taken from the Syrian government it is now under the control of rebranded Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, and I mean the most vengeful sentiments I heard was actually from him and others like him and he was like, I'm a Sunni man and I hate these, these aren't rebels, these are like terrorists, and I hate what they've done to this country. This is not how you rebel against a government, by destroying your own cities. I mean, that's how, I'm just telling you what he told me. That's how they view it. And they want to light those, people like him want to light those areas on fire because he feels personally disgusted because it's his area that was taken over. It's Sunni areas ultimately that were taken over. So they're actually the most pissed about this. And you see something similar in Iraq, actually. Some of the most vengeful sentiments towards ISIS are people who lived in areas taken over by ISIS, and they actually won't let family members of ISIS, like family members of people who joined ISIS, even back into their villages. So it's like Sunni versus Sunni in this case, which you don't obviously get reflected in the media at all here. But yeah, I mean, the other area I visited in Homs, that it was like a little bit outside of Homs, it's a suburb, it's called El Wad. And this area, when the siege in Baba Amr ended, it was because there was a reconciliation with the government. And under that agreement, the insurgents agreed to basically leave the area, and they all went to El War, which until about 2014 had been a fairly stable area. And it was like one of the few Sunni areas in Homs that wasn't occupied by insurgents and that had remained stable. And a lot of other Sunnis around Homs actually moved there for safety. But then once the insurgents came in, all hell broke loose in El War. And everything went to shit. Like I talked to people who lived through it during that time. There was just constant snipers. Like you couldn't leave your house to go get bread because there was just constant fighting because the rebels would fight from residential areas. So they were really happy. And I went there about a month after a reconciliation had taken place. And so it was just sort of starting to come back to some semblance of normalcy. But people were pissed and they wanted revenge.
I would just want to step back a little bit. I have a friend who I got into listening to moderate rebels who isn't as deeply immersed in, the issues we talk about all the time. And he said that, listening to the first few shows helped him understand Syria in a different way. And it started to make sense to him why this civil conflict was happening, or what we can call he didn't even understand that there was a proxy war. And he asked me just a basic question: why are all these countries attacking Syria? I mean, it's such a basic question that scarcely gets answered for people in the West. Why are these countries sponsoring the insurgents? Why are they doing this? And I guess I would put that to you, Ben, and I would also ask you, Rania, to talk about you've been talking about what average Syrians think, and we never hear from them. We only hear the selected, rebel mascots, whether it's, what's her name, Leila Shammi, who speaks English and was in Eastern Aleppo, or, Bana Alabed, who reads the script and is basically a Turkish psyop sponsored now by Simon & Schuster. I don't even know what it is. We don't really hear from the regular Syrians. So I guess I would just ask you what do they think at this point? But Ben, maybe you can just give us kind of an overview of why this catastrophe happened, What did each country want? And, you know, Turkey kind of like pulled its card out during the, you know, which allowed for the Eastern Aleppo operation to take place in 2016. Where do these countries stand now?
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, what you just acknowledged is that it's not a static answer. There's not one single answer. It's historically contextual because the position of some of these countries has shifted, especially Turkey. But I'm glad you mentioned that about Aleppo and Turkey because earlier we were talking about the battle to retake eastern Aleppo. This was in late 2016, and everyone in the U.S. corporate media was going bonkers. They were completely, you know, foaming at the mouth when it came to this. They were comparing it to the Holocaust. Of course, there's been very little reporting on the aftermath in Aleppo and all of the ridiculous announcements they made that they said, oh, there's going to be a massacre of civilians after, there's going to be ethnic cleansing, blah, blah, blah. Similar to the myths that were spewed about Benghazi in Libya. Oh, Gaddafi is going to massacre civilians. Of course, none of this ever transpired. In the case of Libya, NATO overthrew the government, so we never saw what would have not happened. The fact that this massacre would not have happened, as the British House of Commons parliamentary report acknowledged. But in the case of Syria, we actually see something very similar. And you asked what the situation was in eastern Aleppo, because a lot of people in the U.S. who are listening to these media reports don't really understand who the insurgents are, what the regime that they've constructed looks like, which is infinitely worse than the Syrian regime, which, you know, there's a lot to criticize. And the answer to that question actually is, I tell people to go read an article in the New York Times, of all places, called Aleppo After the Fall. And of all people, it was actually written by Robert F. Worth. Robert F. Worth is by no stretch of the imagination any kind of anti-war voice. He's certainly not a dissident. He, in fact, was the former chief of the New York Times Beirut Bureau and is an extremely establishment in his politics. But he published this article in May 2017, and he visited Aleppo and spoke to some people. And I'm just going to read this paragraph that he wrote, which just summarizes it very succinctly. And it actually amplifies the Syrian voices we're always told we're supposed to listen to. Of course, when we're told by opposition supporters we have to listen to Syrian voices, they only mean people who support regime change, people who live in the West and go to grad school at NYU, people who live in London and go to grad school at SOAS. But Robert F. Worth, a mainstream New York Times reporter, wrote, quote, "In March, I met a lawyer named Anas Ghouta who took part in some of the 2011 protests. Ghouta no longer considers himself a member of the opposition. I asked him why. And then the Syrian replied to him, quote, "No one is 100% with the regime, but mostly these people are unified by their resistance to the opposition." And then the Syrian, again, who previously supported the opposition, but later now supports the government, he added, quote, "They know what they don't want, not what they want," which is, of course, similar to this cliche, the devil that you know is worse than the devil that you don't. It doesn't mean that all these people just like worship Assad, and that's like a ridiculous racist stereotype, that all these people in the Middle East just worship dictators because they're incapable of democracy. No, it's just they prefer this over these sectarian death squads that were imposed on them by outside forces. And then Robert F. Worth goes on in this New York Times piece, and he says, "For exiled Syrians, the specter of Assad's crimes looms so large they cannot see anything else. They refuse to acknowledge the realities of a rebellion that is corrupt, brutal, and compromised by foreign sponsors. Eastern Aleppo may not have been Raqqa, where ISIS advertised its rigid Islamist dystopia and its mass beheadings, but as a symbol of Syria's future, Aleppo was almost as bad, a chaotic wasteland full of feuding militias, some of them radical Islamists, who hoarded food and weapons while the people starved." I mean, it's all right there. A Syrian former supporter of the opposition called Aleppo, quote, "a Turkish card guarded by jihadis." So just going back for a second and understanding.
Why was it a Turkish card? I mean, we all know the answer, but explain, you know, what did Turkey want? Qatar, you know, was heavily invested in the rebels in East Aleppo, particularly Jabhat al-Nusra and Arar al-Sham, along with Turkey. Why?
In Aleppo, there was factories. Aleppo was like it was a base of just like hundreds of factories that produced all kinds of goods. Syria used to be extremely self-sufficient and made produced its own food, its own clothing. And in terms of clothing, there was a lot of factories there. And the areas where the factories existed were actually taken over by rebels. And all of the equipment was moved by rebels from Syria to Turkey. Like they stole the equipment
They just stripped the assets of East Aleppo.
And now a lot of Syrian refugees, children, work in factories in Turkey using that equipment to now make clothing that used to be made in Syria. What Turkey, I mean, they hate Turkey and Aleppo. Turkey views Aleppo as it's like they have this Ottoman hangover. They think Aleppo belongs to them. I actually when I was in Aleppo, went to the Chamber of Commerce there, and they have a picture of Erdogan on the floor as like a placemat so that you walk on his face as you go into the Chamber of Commerce. They despise him. All the business class of Aleppo hates Erdogan. He stole all their business. That's how they see him. I just wanted to throw that out there because Turkey gained so much from the destruction of eastern Aleppo.
Of course. So this is part of it. Before answering that question, I just wanted to inform listeners that this shouldn't be a controversial position. The former New York Times Beirut bureau chief openly acknowledged it in an article that probably 20 people read. I mean, no one actually reads these long articles, especially people who are politically active and supportive of the opposition, etc. But this shouldn't be this crazy controversial position. And the idea that it's like some Assadist talking point is outrageous. But to answer the question, why? I mean, there are a lot of factors why, of course. Turkey has been historically a longtime rival of Syria. Specifically in the 80s and 90s, there was a kind of low-intensity war that was called the undeclared war, if you will, between these two countries. So in fact, there is a kind of eerie historical echo of what happened in the current war in 2011. If you go back to 1982 in Hama, the Muslim Brotherhood rises up, and very similar to what happened in 2011, and tries to overthrow the Syrian government, this time under Hafez Assad, Bashar's father. The government responds very brutally, and
they killed many police officers in Hama. It was a very violent revolt.
Oh, of course.
It was militarized.
It also took place. There was also years leading up to it where the Muslim Brotherhood inside Syria was committing acts like car bombings. Yeah.
Car bombs in Damascus. I mean, they were killing civilians across the country.
Well, the goal was to overthrow the government through these acts of terror. And in response, the Syrian government responded as it always does, which is overwhelming force, as many governments do, and crushed the uprising and killed thousands of people. Well, what is not often acknowledged when we hear this, it's called the Hama massacre, and it was a massacre. Of what's not mentioned is it's always depoliticized when it's discussed, as if Hafez Assad murdered all these people just for fun. But of course, what's not ever acknowledged is that Turkey supported many of these Muslim Brotherhood insurgents trying to topple the government in the early 1980s. Also, of course, they received longtime support from the US and UK through the CIA, MI6, through intelligence services. So to understand the context of Turkish-Syrian relations, so Turkey helps fund an insurgency to try to overthrow the Syrian government in the early 1980s. The Syrian government responds by supporting the PKK and Kurdish revolutionary groups. This is, of course, toward the end of the Cold War, when there were still a lot of communist militias, and many of these were socialist and communist militias. So there's this kind of low-intensity proxy war that has been going on between Turkey and Syria for a long time. It's not entirely new. But of course, when protests began in early 2011 in Syria, Turkey saw another opportunity to destabilize its historic rival. Of course, Turkey is governed by the Muslim Brotherhood, the AKP. Erdogan is probably the most powerful leader of a Muslim Brotherhood affiliate. And Turkey is also a member of NATO and is closely allied with the US, with many other countries that have also been trying to overthrow Syria. It bears mentioning, even though it sounds like a very simplistic explanation, but we need to stress that Syria is one of the only allies of Iran and Russia in the Middle East. If you look, it's surrounded by countries. Jordan, which is basically a proxy of the US. This is just a decadent monarchy that has been propped up by the US and the UK for decades. We have, of course, Turkey, which is a member of NATO. We have Iran, which is allied with Syria. And then we have Lebanon, which, it's a complex political state, but it is not a powerful state. And elements of it are allied with the Syrian government, but elements of it are also viciously opposed to the Syrian government and are allied with forces like Saudi Arabia.
So Syria, at least since the 70s, but really since 67, and it's been under siege and in a state of emergency. I mean, you didn't even mention Israel, which has repeatedly attacked Syria and continues to do so and has done so over 200 times but this all influences the decision-making of the Syrian government leadership. And it all came out after 2011. I think Turkey played the most critical role, through in Incirlik Air Base and arming the rebels through its border. Gaziantep, that's like the base of, it's Spooksville. It's like the base of every Western intelligence and Gulf intelligence agency and every kind of PSYOP operation and every journalist who wants to go take a little toe tap jaunt across the Syrian border. I'm not going to name any names or any Ralph Steadman impersonators, but that's what the Turkey plays the role in many ways that Pakistan played in Afghanistan in the 1980s.
That's right. There are so many parallels to the CIA's covert war in Afghanistan in the 1980s. And we need to keep in mind that it wasn't just Pakistan, but also Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia spent billions of dollars helping the CIA arm and train the Mujahideen, who again were far-right Islamist extremists who became eventually Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, just like the so-called moderate rebels supported by the CIA and the Gulf states in Turkey and Syria metastasized into ISIS.
Also, Turkey's border, Turkey allowed like tens of thousands of foreign fighters to come join the jihad in Syria.
So ISIS is a byproduct.
Of course, and the Turkish border, the southern border with Syria, has long been known as the jihadi highway. And even Joe Biden, as we mentioned in a previous episode, acknowledged that Turkey and, of course, Saudi Arabia were supporting openly many of these Salafi jihadist groups, including ISIS. This is pretty well documented at this point. And actually, I interviewed at The Real News a former Turkish counterterrorism official, Ahmet Yayla. Ahmet Yayla was the former head of counterterrorism for the Turkish National Police. And he was basically disciplined and kind of pushed out. He later left the country because he was pushing back against the Turkish government's policy of supporting ISIS. You know, states are complex entities, of course. We talk about the deep state. And Ahmet was in charge of counterterrorism for the police. And the police, because they're responsible for domestic security, ostensibly, but also crushing protests, etc. But he was actually concerned about the threat that ISIS terrorism presented inside Turkey. So, of course, as the head of the counterterrorism for the Turkish National Police, he was concerned about ISIS's influence. But then he had members of the federal government that were coming to him and pressuring him, saying, no, you need to let these ISIS fighters take refuge in Turkey and cross the border to go fight in Syria because of our foreign policy prerogatives. So you had this contradiction between the national and the international policies of the Turkish state. And then he's eventually kind of pushed out. He now lives in the US, Ahmet Yayla, and he's openly talked about how Erdogan had a policy of supporting ISIS. This should not be controversial. In fact, he wrote an article in Foreign Policy about this recently. But this narrative has been constructed that the war in Syria is just about a bloodthirsty dictator who likes to kill people for fun, and the foreign states around him, none of which are democracies, want to bring a democracy to Syria. Somehow Saudi Arabia has spent billions of dollars to bring democracy to a country when it has never had democracy in its entire history.
So where does Turkey stand now? They've taken Afrin. Erdogan has met with Putin. They've talked about, purchasing the S-400 system from Russia, which is over the, F-35 from the U.S. The situation is fluid. Turkey, as I mentioned before, is a part of the peace process with Iran and Russia and Syria. Where's the situation now? And also, I think, we should mention Qatar, which is another real major player here, along with Al Jazeera. I mean, where do they fit in?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to take the entire episode, but of course, just explaining some of the nuances for listeners. I mean, we could spend an entire episode, multiple episodes, talking about Turkey's policy in Syria. In fact, we should do some coverage of that in the future. So I don't have time to go into that in great detail here, but what I can say is that it looks very clear that Turkey's policy is trying to carve up northern Syria and turn these areas into spheres of influence. So you mentioned the city of Afrin, which was traditionally a Kurdish majority city that was controlled by forces that actually were somewhat sympathetic to the Syrian government and in fact asked for support. The YPG in Afrin asked for support from the Syrian army to help fight the Turkish army and the Salafi jihadist, so-called moderate rebel proxies that were embedded within the Turkish army, ethnically cleansing civilians from the town of Afrin. About 2/3, 200,000 of the Kurdish inhabitants of that town were ethnically cleansed, and it was taken over. One of the first things they did was put up a Turkish flag, not a Syrian flag, and you can see videos from the Anadolu Agency, the Turkish state media, in which children in schools inside Afrin, this is inside Syria, are being brainwashed and told to chant slogans thanking Erdogan, thanking Turkey. There are photos of Erdogan on the wall, and all the little kids are waving Turkish flags. There's something similar going on in Aleppo and Trablus, Al-Bab, a lot of these other northern Syrian cities that are near the Turkish border. Turkey is clearly trying to carve this territory up, and it looks like we'll see what happens. The Syrian government, of course, wants to regain all of its territory, but it looks like that might not be what happens. It looks like foreign powers may come to an agreement and allow Turkey to essentially annex this territory or at least turn it into a kind of sphere of influence. So it's hard to say exactly what will happen there. Iran hasn't taken as much of a pro-Turkish line as Russia has in the past year and a half, as Russia and Turkey have grown closer together. So who knows? Russia may agree that in order to end the war in Syria and bring about peace, that Turkey can take over parts of northern Syria against the will of the Syrian government. That's a possibility. As for Qatar, Qatar is the strongest supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood in the region, along with Turkey. And what's interesting about this split in the Gulf is that this blockade of Qatar by Saudi Arabia and the UAE has pushed not only Qatar a little closer to Iran, although that's exaggerated, but it's also pushed Qatar even closer to Turkey. And if you look at TRT World, Turkish state media, and Al Jazeera, both of them in the past several months since this blockade began have been extremely supportive of each other. So Al Jazeera is doing a bunch of pro-Erdogan coverage, and TRT World is doing a bunch of pro-Qatar coverage. And there are a variety of reasons for that. Of course, they're close trade partners, a lot of economic reasons.
That's called like a reach around or something, the media reach around.
But Turkey, again, is governed by the Muslim Brotherhood, and Qatar, since the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring in late 2010 and early 2011, the Muslim Brotherhood has played a key role in some of these uprisings, particularly in Egypt. And if you look at Al Jazeera's coverage, Al Jazeera was basically the voice of the Muslim Brotherhood in the region. Since then, there have been some other media outlets that have emerged, specifically Middle East Monitor, which is extremely pro-Muslim Brotherhood and is funded by Muslim Brotherhood operatives.
Middle East Eye.
Al
Arabi.
Yeah, Al Arabi Al Jadid, which is not the same thing as Al Arabiya, which is Saudi regime media, but rather the New Arab, Al Arabi Al Jadid. But yeah, these are all pro-Qatar media outlets that are funded by either prominent members of the Qatari ruling family or by prominent business people who made their money in Qatar. And of course, they're extremely pro-Muslim Brotherhood if they're not senior members of the Ikhwan. The New Arab is actually a bit different. It was founded as a supposed more progressive alternative to Al Jazeera, and Al Arabi Al Jadid is supposed to be a little less pro-Muslim Brotherhood, but they're all cut from the same cloth. And when we look at Syria, of course, we see that Qatar and Turkey were supporting many of these Salafi militias that were maybe not nominally aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood, specifically Ahrar Sham. And then, of course, Saudi Arabia, which considers the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, was supporting some of the competing groups and specifically trying to get Jaish al-Islam, also Al-Qaeda, but Jaish al-Islam.
The moderates of Jaish al-Islam.
So Saudi Arabia supported the Aloush gang, which, set up its little Islamist fiefdom east of Damascus, and Mohammed Aloush was the key negotiator in Geneva, and basically wouldn't budge on anything. Saudi Arabia paid for Riyadh Hijab to basically be the de facto head of the opposition in London, and he spoke before his grassroots constituency at the International Institute for National Security Studies at this centrist think tank. But Saudi Arabia was kind of paying for the international wing of they're sort of putting a pretty face on the opposition. But meanwhile, they had this Islamist fiefdom in eastern Ghouta that was putting Alawites in cages and using them as human shields and carrying out all sorts of atrocities. So you have all these players, but it seems to me that Saudi Arabia has kind of, withdrawn a little bit from supporting the insurgents, and it's leaning on Trump to move into northeastern Syria.
I think Turkey is like aiming to annex northern Syria.
Yeah, they want Idlib, and to what extent are they willing to negotiate on Afrin, which they've just taken?
I don't know. I think they're going to keep it. I think they're going to try and keep it. I think they're going to try and do what Israel's done with the Syrian Golan Heights, which is just kind of like a de facto annexation that no one recognizes internationally, but exists on the ground. I think that Turkey has already sort of like de facto done that. They basically run parts of northern Syria now. It's like under Turkish command. And then you have what you just mentioned in eastern Syria, this sort of new attempt to like create some faction on the ground that keeps it away from the Syrian government's grip.
Right. Macron was like, if we do not do something, Assad and his guys will come back in and control Syria. It's like, oh no. I don't think he should speak in English anymore, but like, why, what,
or French. He should just stop speaking.
Yeah, well, he should just shut up. But it's another leader warning that Syria will take over Syria.
I think what you're seeing happening right now is like the West lost in Syria. The Western imperialist design in Syria did not succeed. That's largely due to the intervention of the Russians on behalf of the Syrian government. And they didn't see that coming, but they lost. Like in Syria, they have no leverage. Like they have 2,000 soldiers occupying eastern Syria, and Trump wants to withdraw them. They want to replace them with like, they don't know who, but either way, that's not even that many soldiers to begin with. They have very little leverage. They lost. And so I think I don't know what their next, like, I don't think there's much they can do in Syria. There really isn't. I mean, you just saw the sort of like ineptitude of the American government in their response in like joining with France and the UK to do this sort of show bombing of Syria that didn't really accomplish anything. They just bombed a bunch of empty buildings, including like a pharmaceutical production facility. But it didn't change the course of the war. They have no leverage, and they can't have any leverage, and they can't change the course of the war because the involvement of the Russians. And I think that's what makes Syria so dangerous now, is that you do have like extremists that have entered the Trump White House, more extreme than like the last batch. And some of them might be insane enough to try and do something bigger in Syria and basically aimed at the Russians.
You had several American soldiers die maybe a month and a half ago in a helicopter crash. It was said to be in Iraq, but it was obvious they were going into Syria to supplement the U.S. presence around Manbij. And, the U.S. had started out kind of at the Al-Tanaf, and it's right on the Iraqi-Syrian border. How many U.S. troops are there? We don't know, at least 2,000. But it was just amazing to me the way that their deaths were reported. It was like there was a deliberate effort to obscure in the eyes of the American public that there is a substantial American troop presence in Syria and that it's very dangerous. Do you see any chance of the U.S. actually being pushed out of Syria, or is Bolton and Pompeo going to kind of put their foot on the gas and kind of intensify conflict between the U.S. and Shia militias? I mean, they keep talking about them needing to be there. Nikki Haley said they need to be there to keep an eye on Iran. Where do they go from here, and what's the plan?
I don't think they know. I think there's a tug of war in the Trump administration. It's mostly between Trump and his national security team. Trump and like James Mattis, maybe. I mean, James Mattis is like the least hawkish voice, James Mad Dog Mattis, who likes shooting people, but also doesn't want World War III. And he's like the lone voice left since Rex Tillerson isn't around anymore. And who knows, maybe James Mattis will get pushed out. But it's really, really concerning because, John Bolton has Donald Trump's ear, and he's a scary dude. And I mean, I don't know if you guys have had a show since he's been.
Well, it's not just Bolton. I mean, I don't know how much influence Bolton has, but I actually had the opportunity to talk to someone who knows Steve Bannon, not a friend of mine. You know, I'm not hanging out with Bannon's crowd, but I tried to.
Don't lie, he's like over right now.
He's down. Yeah, he's right downstairs. Yeah, we're having him on next to talk about our horseshoe alliance. You know, no, but I was trying to find out what was going on with the Trump debate around Afghanistan, and Bannon was, you know, this is Bannon's last stand. He was pushed out after this. But there was a meeting where Bannon and Trump were the only ones arguing against the surge in Afghanistan. You know, probably Eric Prince was like in the ante room waiting to put his little fake army in. But General Joseph Dunford, who's the head of CENTCOM, was the one really pushing alongside McMaster, the predecessor of Bolton, and all the generals, but mainly Dunford and the Joint Chiefs. They were the ones who really wanted to surge. They were the ones who wanted troops in. And I think there's this mentality among the generals that the U.S. has to maintain this perpetual presence in the Middle East, and it kind of gives them something to do. It's like Madeleine Albright said, you know, you have the largest army in the world, you have to do something with it. So it's not just Bolton. I mean, the generals do want to maintain this presence there, but I don't think they have any overriding strategy or any idea of what to do. And you know, it's incredibly dangerous. Just imagine if there are U.S. casualties there.
Well, just imagine. I mean, I don't know that people in the U.S. government want a war with Russia, but you have a situation where you could stumble into war in Syria because there's so many people involved. You can stumble into a war with Iran. You can especially with Russia, it's the most dangerous. It's a nuclear armed state. And like, if the U.S. were to hit something Russian, the Russians would be forced to respond, and you'd have a hot war. Like, that's what's scary in Syria at this point, I think. And then also there's the prospect of a looming war between Israel and Iran, which would likely play out as a war between Israel and Hezbollah, which I think is going to happen at some point soon.
Why is it going to happen?
Because it's been long, and it's been a long time like coming. Everyone's preparing for war. And again, I don't think anybody actually wants one, because especially I think at this point, I mean, there's some, you would know this better than I do, but there's some crazy elements in the Israeli government. But for the most part, I think they understand that Hezbollah can do a lot of damage. If there's a war, they can kill Israelis. They have the capacity to do it. And so I don't think they necessarily want a war. I know Hezbollah doesn't want a war for sure. Lebanon doesn't want a war. But again, you have constant escalation from Israel on the border with Lebanon, constantly using Lebanese airspace to target Syria. They have this like crazy paranoia about Iran being at the border in the Golan, even though Iran really isn't in the Golan, and Hezbollah doesn't have much of a presence there either. It's mostly the Syrian army that continues to fight various insurgent factions. But the point is that you have preparation for war everywhere, and sometimes you can just stumble into it by one person, one side provoking the other. So I don't know. I feel like that's definitely more plausible than maybe the U.S. escalating in Syria, seeing a war between Israel and Iran play out even by proxy.
And Israel's always been kind of used as the sort of the kind of pilot program for what the U.S. wants to do against Iran. It's what Condoleezza Rice called the birth pangs of a new Middle East. When Israel went to war with Hezbollah, it wound up being, you know, the episiotomy of the new Middle East, as our friend Katie Halper once joked. But they thought that this was going to be, you know, kind of a lab experiment for the bombing of Iran. You know, I really, really doubt that Israel wants to get into a war with Hezbollah. They produced actually an internal assessment last year that was reported on in Israeli media that showed that Hezbollah has the offensive capacity to actually take areas in northern Israel and hold them at least for several hours. I don't think Israel even knows what weapon systems Hezbollah possesses after this.
Well, they keep telling certain journalists what weapon system they
Yeah. Yeah.
Mysteriously, they're telling anti-Hezbollah journalists everything about themselves. I mean,
Yeah.
they're so open and transparent.
I don't know why I don't know any Hezbollah commanders. Is there like a pen pal program? Or?
They don't even talk to like Hezbollah commanders don't even talk to like people from the neighborhoods they control. They're not going to anyways talk to like journalists who just come in and leave a week later.
I think the secret is you just go on Twitter and find someone who is in their bio. They say a Hezbollah commander, and you just interview them, and then you get a byline in Newsweek.
Actually, you know what? We should just go ahead and say it. There is a situation in Lebanon that everyone knows about. It's like a secret no one talks about, especially among the journalist crowd there. There's a whole operation of really smart people who just dupe Western journalists. Maybe they both are duping each other. I don't know. But they're these fixers who claim to be able to put people in touch with Hezbollah commanders if you pay a big fee. You pay them a big fee and they take you to someone's house in like Dahia, tell you it's a Hezbollah commander, and they tell you all the things you want to hear. And both sides sort of play into it. It's like a racket. And nobody will talk about it because all the journalists in Lebanon are such good friends. They don't want to get each other in trouble. But anyways, that's why you see all these secrets that are being told about Hezbollah to anti-Hezbollah journalists.
Yeah, some deep intelligence. I mean, which journalists do you think have been duped by this?
The ones who go paintballing with Hezbollah. there's actually like a whole article about paintballing with Hezbollah, but several. And I think that maybe they know to a certain extent too what's going on. Maybe not. Who knows? We don't have to get into the specifics about that, but it's an interesting racket and it's really smart on the part of the fixers.
Well, we're rounding an hour here, so this is going to be the end of part one of our discussion. Please join us to continue hearing our discussion with Rania Khalek here. We'll be talking about the war in Syria, and specifically the three of us will be talking about a lot of the propaganda on the war that made us change our perspective over the years. You know, in the early years, a lot of us, I think we were misguided by some of the ridiculous propaganda, and we'll explain that. And then also we're going to talk about some of the dishonest talking points on Syria, including the idea that the war in Syria is somehow similar to the situation in Israel-Palestine. And we'll also hear more about Rania's reporting from inside Syria. So please join us for part two here at Moderate Rebels.